My mother-in-law is simply too emotional to make decisions right now." The room fell silent the moment Ethan Mitchell said those words. I sat at the head of my own dining table staring at the man I had welcomed into my family 15 years earlier. My daughter Sarah lowered her eyes and said nothing. Around us sat a financial advisor, a bank representative, and people discussing the future of everything my husband and I had built over 4 decades. They spoke as if I weren't there, as if I were already incapable, as if my tears over my husband's illness somehow made me unfit to protect my own family. What Ethan didn't know was that my attorney had already uncovered something that could destroy everything he had planned. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to hear from you. If you've ever felt dismissed or underestimated because of your age or emotions, please share your story in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. If stories about family resilience and justice speak to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let me tell you how it all began. To understand how I ended up sitting at my own dining table while my son-in-law questioned my ability to make decisions, you need to understand the family we used to be. My name is Hazel James. I was 67 years old when all of this happened. And until then, I believed I had been blessed with a life most people would envy. My husband Richard and I had been married for 45 years. 45 years. Even now, saying that number out loud feels unreal. We met when I was 21 and working part-time at a local hardware store in Columbus, Ohio. Richard was a young salesman with big dreams and very little money. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't charming in the way some men are, but he was honest. In a world full of people pretending to be something they weren't, Richard was exactly who he claimed to be. That honesty became the foundation of our marriage. Together, we built a life from almost nothing. We worked long hours. We skipped vacations. We reinvested every dollar we could. Over time, one hardware store became 2. 2 became 4. Then eventually we owned a small but successful chain of building supply stores throughout central Ohio. We were never billionaires. We weren't celebrities, but we were comfortable. More importantly, we had built something meaningful, something we hoped would benefit future generations of our family. Our greatest pride, however, wasn't the business. It was our daughter, Sarah. She was born after years of fertility struggles. I still remember the doctor placing her in my arms. Richard cried harder than I did. From the moment she entered our lives, everything revolved around her. We attended every soccer game, every school concert, every graduation ceremony. When she scraped her knee, we rushed to help. When she succeeded, we celebrated like she'd won an Olympic medal. Maybe that's why what happened later hurt so much. Because Sarah wasn't just my daughter, she was my heart. When she met Ethan Mitchell, she was 27 years old and working for a regional marketing firm. Ethan seemed perfect, at least at first. He was handsome, well-spoken, successful. He worked as a financial consultant and always seemed confident without being arrogant. The first time Richard and I met him, he brought flowers for me and a bottle of Richard's favorite bourbon. That impressed Richard immediately. "Young man pays attention," he told me afterward. For years, Ethan was everything a parent hopes for in a son-in-law. He helped around the house. He remembered birthdays. He called me Mom. Sometimes he called just to ask how Richard and I were doing. When Sarah and Ethan got married, Richard stood beside me during the reception and whispered, "I think she found a good one." At the time, I agreed. Completely. Over the next 15 years, Ethan became part of our family. Holiday dinners, summer barbecues, Sunday football games. He was there for all of it. When Sarah gave birth to our granddaughter Lily, Ethan seemed like a devoted father. The kind of father every child deserves. And Lily adored him. Everyone did. Well, almost everyone. Looking back now, I realize there was one person who never fully trusted Ethan. Richard. The signs were subtle, easy to miss. At family gatherings, Richard would sometimes watch Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not dislike, something closer to caution. One evening, years before the trouble began, I asked him about it. "Do you have a problem with Ethan?" I said. Richard hesitated. Then he shook his head. "No." "But," he smiled slightly, "I just think Ethan likes being in control." I laughed. "So do you." "Maybe," Richard admitted. "But I built something before I started controlling it." I didn't understand what he meant. At the time, I brushed it off. Years passed. Life continued. Then something strange started happening. Every time the subject of finances came up, Ethan became unusually interested. Not in a greedy way, at least not obviously, but he always had questions. Questions about the business, questions about retirement plans, questions about trusts, questions about estate planning. I assumed he was being responsible. After all, he worked in finance. That was his world. One Thanksgiving after dinner, Ethan sat with Richard in the living room discussing succession planning. I remember hearing snippets of the conversation. What happens to the stores someday? Is everything already protected? Have you updated the trust recently? Perfectly reasonable questions. At least they seemed reasonable. But afterward, Richard looked thoughtful, quiet, more thoughtful than usual. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, he said something that would stay with me for years. "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll read every document before signing it." I laughed. "What kind of advice is that?" "I'm serious, Hazel." I rolled my eyes. "You know, I always read things." "Read them twice." His tone surprised me. "Why?" He stared toward the window. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he simply said, "Because people change when money becomes involved." I thought he was being overly cautious. Richard had always been careful, always planning, always preparing for worst-case scenarios. I kissed his cheek and told him not to worry. Neither of us knew then how important that conversation would become. Over the next few years, Richard quietly met with attorneys and financial advisors more often. When I asked why, he would smile and say he was organizing things, making life easier for us later. I appreciated that. In fact, I was grateful. What I didn't know was that he wasn't simply organizing paperwork. He was preparing for something, or perhaps protecting us from someone. At the time, I had no idea. To me, Ethan was still the loving son-in-law who attended family dinners and helped carry groceries, the man who called me Mom, the man who hugged Richard every Christmas, the man everyone trusted, including me, especially me. And that is exactly why I never saw the danger coming. Because sometimes the people who hurt us most aren't strangers. They're the people we've invited into our homes, the people we've trusted with our hearts, the people we've treated like family. And by the time we realize who they truly are, they've already learned where all the doors are and where all the keys are hidden. The day everything began to change started like any other Tuesday. Richard woke up early, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat on our back porch reading the newspaper. It was something he had done for decades, rain or shine, summer or winter. Richard liked starting his mornings in the same chair overlooking our backyard. At around 8:30, I heard a strange sound, a thud. At first, I thought he had dropped his coffee mug. Then I heard another sound, a weak groan. I rushed outside. Richard was on the ground. His newspaper lay scattered beside him. One side of his face looked different. His speech was slurred. His right arm wouldn't move properly. I knew immediately what was happening. "Richard!" I dropped to my knees beside him. He tried to speak but couldn't form the words. My hands shook as I called 911. The next few hours felt like a blur. Sirens, doctors, tests, questions, fear. So much fear. After 45 years together, I couldn't imagine life without him. The doctors eventually confirmed that Richard had suffered a mild stroke. Compared to what could have happened, we were fortunate. He survived. He could still speak. He could still recognize everyone. But recovery would take time. And at 71 years old, even a mild stroke changes things. The strongest man I had ever known suddenly needed help walking, needed help remembering medication schedules, needed help managing stress. The stroke didn't take away who Richard was, but it reminded us both that he was no longer invincible. For the first few weeks, our family rallied around us. Sarah visited almost every day. Lily came after school whenever she could. And Ethan became indispensable. At least that's how it seemed. He showed up constantly, sometimes before I even knew I needed help. He drove Richard to appointments, picked up prescriptions, handled insurance paperwork, answered phone calls, organized medical files. Everywhere I looked, Ethan was helping, and I was grateful, deeply grateful. One evening after Ethan spent 3 hours helping organize medical bills, I hugged him. "I don't know what we'd do without you." He smiled. "That's what family is for Mom." At the time, those words comforted me. Now they make my stomach turn. As Richard's recovery continued, Ethan became involved in more areas of our lives. Not just medical matters, financial matters too. It happened gradually, so gradually that I barely noticed. One afternoon, he offered to help pay some household bills online. Another day, he volunteered to review insurance documents. Then he suggested organizing our financial records in case of emergencies. Every suggestion sounded reasonable, helpful, responsible. Especially because I was exhausted. Anyone who has cared for a sick spouse understands. The physical exhaustion is difficult. The emotional exhaustion is worse. You spend every day worrying, every day monitoring medications, every day wondering if another emergency is coming. By the time evening arrives, even simple decisions feel overwhelming. Ethan seemed to recognize that. Whenever I felt stressed, he stepped forward. Whenever I hesitated, he offered solutions. Whenever paperwork arrived, he volunteered to handle it. At first, I viewed him as a blessing. Then small things started happening. Little things. The kind of things that don't seem important until much later. One afternoon, I called our bank with a question about a transfer. The representative surprised me. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell already discussed that with us." I frowned. "Mr. Mitchell? Your son-in-law?" I felt confused. Why was Ethan speaking to our bank about our accounts? When I asked him later, he smiled casually. "You were busy taking care of Richard. I was just helping. The explanation sounded reasonable, so I let it go." A week later, I discovered he had contacted our insurance company. Again, he explained that he was helping. Again, I believed him. Then came the doctor's office. Richard and I arrived for a follow-up appointment. The physician mentioned concerns that Ethan had raised regarding Richard's long-term care. I looked at Richard. Richard looked at me. Neither of us had known Ethan was having private conversations with the doctor. That bothered me, but not enough. Not yet. Because Ethan always had an answer, always had a justification. always had a way of making me feel guilty for questioning him. I was trying to help. I'm thinking ahead. Someone has to be prepared. Over time, Sarah began repeating some of those same phrases. That worried me more than anything. One evening, she sat with me in the kitchen while Richard rested upstairs. You know, Ethan is only trying to make things easier. I stared at her. I know. Then why do you seem upset? I hesitated, because I wasn't entirely sure myself. Something felt off. But I couldn't explain what. It wasn't one specific action. It was a pattern, a feeling. The sense that Ethan was slowly moving from helping our family to managing our family. And there is a difference, a very important difference. Helping respects boundaries. Managing replaces them. I noticed another change in Richard, too. He became quieter whenever Ethan was around, more watchful. One night after Sarah and Ethan left, Richard sat silently in the living room. I asked what he was thinking. He took a long time to answer. Finally, he said, "Has Ethan been asking questions about the trust?" My heart skipped slightly. "Yes." Richard nodded slowly. "What kind of questions?" "Estate questions. Financial questions. Future planning." Richard leaned back in his chair. His expression darkened. That was unusual. Richard rarely showed negative emotions. "Richard." He looked at me. "Be careful." The words landed heavily. "Careful of what?" He rubbed his forehead. "I don't know yet." That answer frustrated me. You either trust him or you don't. I trust what people do more than what they say. What does that mean? Again, he hesitated. Then he changed the subject. At the time, I thought his stroke might be making him overly cautious, maybe even suspicious. I hate admitting that now, because he was trying to warn me, and I wasn't listening. Over the next month, Ethan's involvement increased further. He started attending meetings he hadn't been invited to, reviewing documents no one had requested him to review, offering opinions before anyone asked. And somehow people listened. Bank employees listened. Advisors listened. Even Sarah listened. One afternoon, I overheard Ethan speaking with Sarah in the next room. They didn't know I could hear them. "Your mom is under a lot of stress," Ethan said. "I know. She's making emotional decisions." A silence followed. Then Sarah replied quietly, "Maybe." I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Heartbreak. Because for the first time I realized Ethan wasn't simply helping us navigate a crisis. He was creating a narrative, a story in which I was overwhelmed, a story in which I was emotional, a story in which I needed guidance. At the time, I still didn't understand where that story was leading. I only knew that it was spreading. And once people start believing a story about you, it becomes very difficult to change their minds. What frightened me most was that Ethan wasn't acting like a man making impulsive decisions. He was acting like a man following a plan that had started long before I realized I was part of it. And soon I would discover just how far that plan had already gone. The first time someone questioned my judgment to my face, it wasn't Ethan. It was my doctor. And that was when I realized just how far Ethan's influence had spread. I had gone in for a routine physical. Nothing serious, just my annual checkup. The appointment was nearly over when Dr. Carson glanced at his notes and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Hazel, have you been experiencing increased anxiety lately?" I blinked. "Not more than any woman whose husband recently had a stroke." He nodded thoughtfully. And have you found decision-making difficult? I stared at him. What kind of decision-making? He hesitated. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Your son-in-law expressed concerns that you've been feeling overwhelmed. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Ethan had been discussing my mental and emotional state with my physician, without my knowledge, without my permission. I forced a smile and finished the appointment. But the drive home felt different. Something inside me had shifted. The discomfort I had been trying to ignore for months suddenly felt impossible to dismiss. This wasn't just help anymore. This was interference. And worse, it was working. Because Dr. Carson wasn't asking those questions randomly. Someone had planted those concerns. Someone had deliberately created doubt. About me. That evening I sat alone in the kitchen long after dinner. The house was quiet. Richard had gone upstairs to rest. I stared out the window while replaying the conversation in my mind. Overwhelmed. Emotional. Struggling. The same words kept appearing. Words Ethan used constantly. Words Sarah had started repeating. Words that seemed harmless on the surface. But together they formed a picture. A picture of a woman losing control. A woman whose judgment could no longer be trusted. I suddenly remembered something Laura Bennett had once told Richard years ago. Perception matters, especially in legal matters. At the time, I hadn't understood why she said it. Now, I was beginning to. A few days later, Sarah came over for lunch. As we sat together, I decided to bring it up. Did Ethan talk to Dr. Carson? Sarah looked surprised. I think he may have. Why? He was worried about you. I set down my fork. Worried about me? You've been under a lot of stress, Mom. I felt irritation rising. Stress doesn't mean incompetence. I didn't say it did. But that's where this seems to be heading. Sarah sighed. Mom, nobody is attacking you. Those words hurt more than she realized, because people often say that when an attack is already happening, and because they don't recognize it themselves. I changed the subject, but after she left, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. Sarah genuinely believed Ethan was helping. That was the frightening part. He wasn't manipulating people through threats. He was manipulating them through concern. Concern is powerful. People lower their defenses when someone claims to care. And Ethan knew exactly how to use that. Over the next few weeks, the comments became more frequent. Small comments, subtle comments, dangerous comments. At a family dinner, I forgot where I had placed my reading glasses. Ethan laughed lightly. See, that's why we're all helping out. Everyone chuckled. I forced a smile. Inside, I felt humiliated. A week later, I became emotional while discussing Richard's recovery. I cried, naturally. My husband of 45 years had nearly died. But Ethan immediately placed a hand on my shoulder. That's why you shouldn't have to worry about financial decisions right now. The room went quiet. Again. Nobody challenged him. Nobody said what I was thinking, that grief and incompetence are not the same thing, that tears don't erase intelligence, that fear doesn't erase experience. But the comments continued, one after another, always presented as kindness, always wrapped in concern, always designed to create the same impression. Hazel isn't capable anymore. One afternoon, I visited Richard's office at our oldest store. Even after his stroke, he still liked spending a few hours there occasionally. The office felt smaller than I remembered, older, filled with decades of memories. Photographs lined the walls, awards, certificates, pictures of family vacations. Pictures of Sarah growing up. Pictures of Lily as a little girl. I sat at Richard's desk while he spoke with a manager. As I waited, my eyes drifted toward a stack of documents. One page caught my attention. At first, I wasn't even sure why. Something looked familiar. Then I realized what it was. Richard's signature. But something felt wrong. I picked up the page. It appeared to be part of a trust-related document. The signature looked like Richard's, yet not quite. A subtle difference. A slight hesitation in one letter, an unusual curve in another. When Richard returned, I showed him the page. "Do you remember signing this?" He adjusted his glasses, studied it carefully, then frowned. "No. You don't remember. I've never seen this before." The air seemed to leave the room. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." He looked at the signature again. Then his expression darkened. "I didn't sign this." A chill ran through me. Perhaps there was an explanation. A draft. A copy. A clerical mistake. But deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. Richard immediately requested additional files. The store manager brought several folders. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing paperwork. Most documents were legitimate. Some contained signatures Richard recognized. Others did not. Not many. Just enough to be troubling. When we returned home that evening, neither of us said much. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Ethan has been asking a lot of questions about the trust." There it was again. The trust. Always the trust. Always the future. Always control. I looked at him. "Do you think he's involved?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the window, the same way he had months earlier, the same way he always did when he was trying to process something difficult. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know." Then he added 4 words that changed everything. "But I don't trust it." Not him. It. The situation. The pattern. The growing collection of things that didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced through every interaction I'd had with Ethan over the previous year, every conversation, every suggestion, every document, every offer to help. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Ethan meant well and started asking a different question. What if all of this was intentional? What if the comments weren't random? What if the concern wasn't genuine? What if someone was deliberately building a case that painted me as emotionally unstable, a case that portrayed me as incapable, a case that would justify taking important decisions out of my hands? The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at my reflection, studying my own face, my own eyes. I was grieving. I was tired. I was scared. But I was not confused. I was not incompetent, and I was certainly not incapable. For 45 years, I had helped build a business, raised a family, managed finances, solved problems, protected the people I loved. No one was going to erase that simply by repeating a lie often enough. What I didn't know yet was that Ethan's campaign against me was already far more advanced than I imagined. And somewhere among the growing stack of documents, there was proof that his plan had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. 3 weeks after Richard and I discovered the questionable documents, Ethan invited everyone to dinner. Looking back, I realize it wasn't really a family dinner. It was a meeting. A carefully planned meeting, one designed to push me exactly where he wanted me. The invitation sounded innocent enough. Sarah called on a Sunday afternoon. "Mom, Ethan thought it would be nice for everyone to have dinner together. I hesitated. Just family. There was a brief pause. Mostly. That answer immediately put me on edge. Mostly family dinners aren't usually described that way. Still, I agreed. Partly because I wanted to spend time with Sarah and Lily, partly because I wanted to see what Ethan was doing, and partly because Richard encouraged me to go. "We need to know what comes next," he said quietly. Neither of us trusted our instincts completely yet, but we trusted them enough to pay attention. The dinner was scheduled for Thursday evening at Sarah and Ethan's house. When Richard and I arrived, my concerns immediately intensified. There were extra cars in the driveway, cars I didn't recognize. Inside, I quickly discovered why. In addition to Sarah and Lily, 2 other guests were present. One was a financial advisor named Mark Reynolds. The other was a woman from a regional banking institution. A woman I had met only once before. No one had mentioned either of them would be attending. I exchanged a glance with Richard. His expression hardened instantly. He noticed it too. This wasn't dinner. This was something else. The evening began normally enough. We talked about Lily's school activities, the weather, sports, community events. Everyone smiled, everyone laughed, everyone pretended. But beneath the surface, I could feel tension building. Ethan seemed unusually focused, almost rehearsed, as if he were waiting for the right moment to begin. That moment arrived shortly after dessert. The plates had barely been cleared when Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "Since everyone is here," he said, "there are a few important topics we should discuss." My stomach tightened. Richard remained silent. Sarah looked uncomfortable. The banker and financial advisor suddenly became very interested, almost as if they already knew what was coming, which I suspect they did. Ethan folded his hands together. "The last year has been difficult for everyone." No one responded. He continued. "Richard's health scare reminded us how important planning can be." Still no response. Then he turned toward me, directly toward me, and everything changed. "Hazel, you've been carrying an enormous emotional burden." There it was again. Emotional. The word had become his favorite weapon. I forced a polite smile. "I'm managing." "I know you're trying." Trying? Not succeeding. Trying. The distinction wasn't accidental. I could feel it. The banker nodded sympathetically. Mark Reynolds nodded too. Suddenly, I understood. They had already heard this narrative. They already believed it. Ethan continued speaking. "You've been under tremendous stress. Watching someone you love suffer is incredibly difficult." I remained silent, because arguing would make me appear emotional, and Ethan knew that. Every word was carefully chosen. Every sentence built the same story. Hazel is struggling. Hazel is overwhelmed. Hazel needs help. Then came the moment I'll never forget, the moment that opened this story. Ethan looked around the room before saying, "To be honest, I think Hazel is simply too emotional to make major decisions right now." The silence that followed felt endless. I could hear the ticking of a wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even my own heartbeat. No one spoke. No one challenged him. No one defended me. Not immediately. The deepest wound came from Sarah, my daughter, my only child. She lowered her eyes and said nothing. That silence hurt more than Ethan's words, because silence can feel like agreement. I looked at her, waiting, hoping, praying. But she never looked up. Ethan took her silence as permission to continue. The family trusts the business assets. The property decisions, those things require objectivity. Objectivity, another carefully selected word. The implication was obvious. Hazel lacks objectivity. Hazel lacks judgment. Hazel lacks competence. The banker finally spoke. "We simply want what's best for everyone." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was insulting. People always claim they want what's best for everyone when they're trying to convince someone to surrender power. Ethan slid a folder across the table. Toward me. I looked down at it. My pulse quickened. Documents. Legal documents. Trust-related documents. Exactly as Richard and I had feared. "What's this?" I asked. Mark Reynolds answered. "Just some recommendations." Recommendations. Another harmless-sounding word. I opened the folder. Inside were proposed changes involving management authority over certain family assets. Temporary authority. Temporary oversight. Temporary protections. Everything was described as temporary, but I had lived long enough to understand something important. Temporary arrangements have a habit of becoming permanent, especially when money is involved. I carefully turned each page. Then I looked up. "Who prepared these?" Ethan answered immediately. "We all work together." We. Interesting. Not Richard. Not me. We. The group sitting across from us. The group discussing our future. Our assets. Our lives. Without us. Richard finally spoke. His voice was calm, dangerously calm. "I wasn't consulted." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Ethan smiled. "We were trying to reduce stress." Richard's eyes narrowed. "By excluding us." Nobody answered. For the first time that evening, Ethan appeared slightly uncomfortable. Only slightly. He quickly recovered. "Nobody is excluding anyone." Then he turned back toward me. "Hazel, we're just trying to protect you." "Protect me?" The phrase almost made me angry enough to laugh. I had spent decades protecting my family. Now the man I once considered a son was presenting himself as my protector. As though I were helpless. As though I needed permission to manage my own life. As though everything Richard and I built belonged to him to supervise. I realized something important in that moment. This wasn't about concern. This wasn't about planning. This wasn't even about Richard's health. This was about control, and Ethan was no longer hiding it. The room waited for my answer. The banker, the advisor, Sarah, Ethan, everyone. I could feel their expectations. They wanted me to sign. They wanted me to agree. They wanted me to validate the story Ethan had spent months constructing. The story that said I was too emotional to decide, too overwhelmed to lead, too fragile to be trusted. Instead, I quietly closed the folder. Then I placed it back on the table. Ethan frowned. "What are you saying?" I looked directly into his eyes. "I'm saying I won't sign anything tonight." The atmosphere changed instantly. His smile disappeared. Only for a second. But I saw it. The mask slipped. Just briefly, long enough for me to glimpse the frustration underneath. "Maybe you should take some time to think about it," he said carefully. I nodded. "Oh, I intend to." Then I stood. Richard stood beside me. Neither of us explained further. Neither of us argued. Neither of us raised our voices. We simply left. The drive home was quiet. For nearly 15 minutes, neither Richard nor I spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "He's moving faster than I expected." I nodded. "So what do we do?" Richard looked out the window. Then he said the words that would change everything. "You call Laura Bennett tomorrow morning." I stared at him. "You think it's time?" He turned toward me. His expression was grave. "No, Hazel." He paused. "I think we're already late." What Ethan didn't know was that I had already spoken to Laura once before, and what Laura was about to show us would prove that this dinner had never been about helping me. It had been the next step in a much larger plan, a plan that had been unfolding for far longer than any of us realized. The next morning, I called Laura Bennett. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 6 months. Not because we had grown apart. Quite the opposite. Laura had been part of our lives for almost 20 years. She wasn't just our attorney. She was one of the few people Richard trusted completely. If Richard ever had a legal concern, Laura was the first person he called. And if Laura ever sounded worried, Richard listened. That alone told me something. When I explained what had happened at Ethan's dinner meeting, Laura didn't sound surprised. That bothered me immediately. Most people would have reacted with shock. Laura didn't. Instead, she quietly said, "Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I glanced at Richard. He was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, watching carefully. I put the phone on speaker. "Laura," I asked, "is there something you're not telling us?" A pause followed. Then Laura answered, "There's a lot I need to tell you." The line went silent. For the first time in months, genuine fear settled into my chest. Not fear of Ethan, not fear of losing money. Fear that Richard had been right all along. That evening, we drove to Laura's office in downtown Columbus. The building itself was unremarkable, a brick structure that housed several law firms and accounting offices. Laura had worked there for years. The receptionist greeted us warmly. Within minutes, we were sitting in Laura's private conference room. She entered carrying a thick file. Much thicker than I expected. The sight alone made my heart pound. Nobody brings a file that large to discuss a misunderstanding. Laura closed the door behind her. Then she sat down. For a long moment, she simply looked at Richard, then at me. Finally, she spoke. "Richard came to see me nearly 2 years ago." I felt my stomach tighten. 2 years. This had started 2 years ago. Richard remained silent. Laura continued. "He asked me to review the family trust." That wasn't unusual. We had reviewed our trust several times over the years, but Laura wasn't finished. He also asked me to evaluate potential vulnerabilities. The phrase caught my attention. Potential vulnerabilities. That sounded different, more serious. "What vulnerabilities?" I asked. Laura folded her hands together. "People." The room became very quiet. I looked at Richard. He avoided my eyes. That alone told me how serious this was. Laura opened the file. Inside were dozens of documents, emails, notes, meeting summaries, legal memoranda, years of records. Richard became concerned after noticing a pattern. I looked at my husband. "When?" He finally spoke. "After Ethan started asking questions." The trust again. Always the trust. Laura nodded. At first, Richard thought it might simply be professional curiosity. "Because Ethan works in finance." "Exactly." She pulled out several documents. Then the questions became more specific. Specific. That word mattered. General questions are normal. Specific questions reveal intent. Laura handed me copies. I began reading. Most of the emails were conversations between Ethan and Richard. At first, they seemed harmless. Questions about succession planning, questions about ownership structures, questions about tax implications. Then the tone gradually changed. Ethan became increasingly focused on control, management authority, decision-making power, asset transfers, trustee appointments. The pattern was impossible to ignore once I saw it. My hands trembled slightly as I read. "Richard noticed it too," Laura said. I looked up. "And he never told me—" Richard sighed heavily. "I didn't have proof." That answer sounded exactly like him. Richard wasn't the kind of man who made accusations without evidence. Laura continued. "So we began preparing." Preparing. The word sent chills through me. "What do you mean?" Laura slid another folder toward us. Inside were updated trust documents, revised legal protections, additional safeguards, contingency plans. Richard had quietly spent 2 years strengthening our legal defenses, without telling anyone, including me. I stared at him. "You did all this?" He nodded. "I hoped I'd never need it." For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel hurt or grateful, perhaps both. Laura turned another page. Then she revealed something that shocked me even more. Richard requested an independent cognitive evaluation. I frowned. "What?" She nodded. "For you." I stared at her, then at Richard. My first reaction was anger. For me, why did he doubt me too? Richard immediately understood my expression. "Hazel, listen." Laura gently intervened. "This wasn't because Richard questioned your competence." "Then why?" She leaned forward. "Because he anticipated someone else might." The room fell silent, and suddenly everything clicked. The comments, the concern, the narrative Ethan had been building. Richard had seen it before I did, perhaps long before I did. Laura opened another section of the file. Inside was a formal evaluation performed months earlier. The specialist's conclusion was clear. Hazel James demonstrated full cognitive capacity, excellent reasoning, strong memory, no evidence of impairment, no evidence of diminished judgment, no evidence of decision-making deficiencies. I felt tears sting my eyes, not because of the evaluation, because Richard had quietly protected me, without ever making me feel diminished, without ever suggesting I needed testing. He had done it solely because he feared someone might someday challenge me, and apparently that day had arrived. Laura waited until I finished reading, then she reached into the file again. This time her expression changed, more serious, more cautious. She placed a small digital recorder on the table. My pulse quickened instantly. "What is that?" Laura exchanged a glance with Richard. Then she answered. "It's a recording." "A recording of what?" Neither spoke immediately. That hesitation frightened me. Finally, Richard took a deep breath. "One of my conversations with Ethan." The room seemed to shrink. I stared at the recorder. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. What conversation? Laura pressed a button. Static filled the room. Then voices. Richard's voice. Ethan's voice. The recording appeared to come from nearly a year earlier. At first, the conversation sounded normal. They discussed business matters, investments, retirement. Then the topic shifted. The trust. Once again, the trust. I listened carefully. Richard asked a simple question. "What interests you so much about the trust?" A brief silence followed. Then Ethan laughed. The sound made my skin crawl. Because it wasn't the warm family laugh I knew. It was different, colder, calculating. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Let's be honest, Richard." Another pause. "Eventually, someone will have to take control of all this." Control. Not help. Not support. Control. The recording continued. Ethan spoke casually, almost confidently, as though discussing an inevitable future, a future in which he played a central role, a future in which assets, businesses, and decisions flowed through him. The conversation wasn't enough to prove criminal behavior, but it revealed something equally important: intent. For the first time, I heard the ambition Richard had been worried about. The entitlement, the assumption, the belief that he deserved influence over things he hadn't built. When the recording ended, nobody spoke. I couldn't. I felt sick. Not because Ethan wanted money. Money has destroyed families for centuries. What hurt was realizing he had been pretending to be devoted, pretending to be selfless, pretending to be family, all while quietly positioning himself closer and closer to control. Laura finally broke the silence. "Hazel, what happened at that dinner wasn't spontaneous." I nodded slowly. I knew that now. He has been laying groundwork for a long time. "How long?" I asked. Laura's answer chilled me. "Longer than you think." Then she opened the final section of the file, a section neither Richard nor I had seen before. "I've been conducting my own review." I looked down. Bank communications, email records, document requests, authorization inquiries. My heart started racing again. Because suddenly, I understood. The recording wasn't the biggest problem. The real problem was what Ethan had already been doing behind the scenes, and Laura was about to show us evidence that his plan had gone much further than either Richard or I had imagined. I didn't sleep that night. After leaving Laura Bennett's office, Richard and I sat in our living room for nearly 2 hours without turning on the television. Neither of us wanted distractions. We wanted answers. The problem was that every answer seemed to lead to a more disturbing question. The evidence Laura had shown us wasn't enough to prove a crime. Not yet. But it painted a picture. And it was a picture neither of us liked. A picture of Ethan positioning himself closer and closer to our finances, closer and closer to our legal affairs, closer and closer to decisions that were never his to make. As midnight approached, Richard finally spoke. "What are you thinking?" I stared at the dark window across the room. "I'm thinking about Sarah." That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. Not Ethan. Sarah. Because if Ethan was truly planning something, what did that mean for our daughter? Was she involved? Was she helping him? Had she knowingly stood by while he undermined me, or was she being manipulated too? I honestly didn't know, and that uncertainty hurt. The next morning Laura called. Her voice was calm, professional, but I could hear urgency beneath it. "I need you and Richard to come in again. Did you find something?" A pause followed. Then she answered, "Yes." My stomach tightened immediately. An hour later, we were back in her office. This time there were no pleasantries, no small talk. Laura got straight to the point. She opened a folder and slid several documents across the conference table. "These are authorization requests." I examined them carefully. Most originated from financial institutions, banks, investment firms, asset management companies. The dates stretched back nearly 8 months. My pulse quickened. Why is Ethan's name on these? Laura folded her hands. Because he submitted them. The room went silent. I looked at Richard, then back at Laura. What exactly are these requests for information? Information about what? Your accounts. The words hit me like a punch. Our accounts? She nodded. Not all of them. But enough. I felt anger beginning to rise. How was he allowed to do that? Most requests were denied. That provided little comfort. The fact that he had tried was bad enough. Laura continued. He contacted multiple institutions, more than once, using various explanations. Family assistance, estate planning, financial review, emergency preparedness. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern, a very troubling pattern. Richard leaned forward. How many institutions? Laura looked down at her notes. 7. 7. I stared at her. 7 different financial organizations. 7 separate attempts to gain access to information. 7 opportunities for him to learn details that weren't his business. I suddenly remembered all the questions Ethan had been asking over the years. The trust, the business, retirement accounts, investments, property values. It all fit together now. He wasn't merely curious, he was gathering intelligence. Laura opened another file. This is more concerning. I braced myself. The previous information had already been disturbing enough, but Laura's expression told me this would be worse. She handed us a copy of a legal consultation request. I read the title twice before understanding it. Petition for Guardianship Evaluation. My hands froze. Richard swore quietly under his breath. I looked up. What is this? Laura's answer chilled me. Ethan consulted with an attorney regarding potential guardianship proceedings. The room seemed to tilt. Guardianship. I knew what that meant. Guardianship isn't granted because someone is grieving, or stressed, or emotional. Guardianship is requested when someone is believed incapable of managing their own affairs. Suddenly, every comment Ethan had made sense. Every conversation, every concern, every suggestion. He wasn't just creating a narrative. He was building a case, a legal case, a case designed to portray me as incapable. The realization made me physically ill. Laura continued carefully. To be clear, he hasn't filed anything. Yet. One word. One terrifying word. When? Richard asked. Laura flipped through several pages. The consultation occurred 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. While Ethan was sitting at our dinner table, calling me Mom, helping with groceries, checking on Richard. He had already been exploring ways to strip me of my authority. I felt betrayed in a way I had never experienced before. Not because of the money, not because of the trust, because of the deception, the sheer scale of it. Laura leaned forward. There is something else. Of course there was. By that point, every new revelation seemed worse than the last. She showed us a series of emails. Most were heavily professional. Financial discussions, scheduling requests, document reviews. Then one email caught my attention. It referenced future asset consolidation strategies. The phrase itself wasn't unusual. What came next was, one paragraph specifically discussed simplifying decision-making authority by reducing the number of decision-makers. My eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Laura answered immediately. It means concentrating authority. I understood exactly what she meant, and I didn't like it. Not one bit. The strategy became obvious. Remove Richard through illness. Remove Hazel through incompetence. Concentrate authority elsewhere. The conclusion sat uncomfortably in my mind. I wasn't ready to accuse Ethan of that outright, but I couldn't ignore the direction everything pointed. Then came the biggest surprise of all. The surprise that changed how I viewed Sarah. Laura opened another email thread. "Read this carefully." I did. Then again. Then a third time. The message wasn't from Sarah. It was about Sarah. Specifically about what Ethan had told others regarding Sarah. The email described her as reluctant, uncomfortable, unsure. I frowned. "What does this mean?" Laura answered softly. "It means Sarah may not know everything." The room became quiet. Richard looked at me. I looked at him. For weeks I had been fighting a painful possibility. The possibility that my daughter had chosen Ethan over me. The possibility that she had willingly participated. Now for the first time that assumption cracked. Because the evidence suggested something different. Not innocence. Not exactly. But ignorance. There is a difference. A very important difference. Sarah had defended Ethan. Yes, she had repeated his concerns. Yes, but that didn't necessarily mean she understood the full extent of his actions. Laura seemed to read my thoughts. "I think Ethan shares information selectively." I nodded slowly. That sounded familiar. Very familiar. Because manipulative people rarely tell outright lies. Instead, they tell partial truths. Enough truth to earn trust. Enough omissions to maintain control. And suddenly I could picture it. Sarah hearing Ethan express concern. Sarah believing he wanted to help. Sarah trusting her husband. Because why wouldn't she? She loved him. She had built a life with him. She had trusted him for 15 years. Just as I once had. The realization didn't erase my hurt, but it changed it. My anger toward Sarah softened. My concern for her grew. Because if Ethan was willing to manipulate me, he was certainly capable of manipulating her. Laura closed the folder. "We need to move carefully." Richard nodded. "What are our options?" Laura didn't hesitate. "We gather evidence." "What kind?" "Everything. Emails, bank records, communication logs, document histories, authorization requests, electronic signatures. Every detail mattered now. Every detail could become important later." Then Laura said something that caught me completely off guard. "Do not confront Ethan." I blinked. "Why not?" "Because right now, he believes he's winning." The sentence hung in the air. Laura continued. "That makes him careless." I understood immediately. People hide their intentions when they're worried. They reveal them when they're confident. And Ethan was very confident. He believed his narrative was working. He believed people saw me as emotional. He believed Sarah trusted him. He believed Richard was weakened. Most importantly, he believed we knew far less than we actually did. Laura stood. Then she looked directly at me. "Hazel, you're going to need patience." I managed a small smile. "I've been married 45 years. For the first time that day, Laura laughed. "Then you're more qualified than most." As Richard and I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not comfort, not relief, determination. For too long I had been reacting, defending, explaining, trying to prove I wasn't emotional. I was done doing that. Now it was time to prove something else. That I was paying attention. That I was capable. and that if Ethan believed I was too emotional to make decisions, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Because while he was busy building a case against me, Laura Bennett was quietly building one against him, and neither of us intended to lose. For the first time in nearly a year, I stopped feeling like a victim. That may sound strange. After all, Ethan was still working behind the scenes. He was still influencing people, still spreading the idea that I was too emotional to manage my own affairs, still positioning himself closer to the trust and the family assets. But something had changed. I finally knew what he was doing. And knowledge is power. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Once you understand the threat, you can begin fighting back. Laura Bennett made that very clear. "We're not going to react emotionally," she told me. "We're going to respond strategically." Those words became my focus. Strategically, not emotionally. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, Ethan had been portraying me as a woman ruled by feelings. Now the strongest weapon I had was patience. The next several weeks became the most exhausting period of my life. Not because of Richard's health, not because of financial concerns, because every day felt like a carefully planned chess match. One wrong move could give Ethan exactly what he wanted. Laura created a list, a very long list. Every item represented evidence we needed: bank records, authorization requests, document histories, property files, medical evaluations, communication logs, trust amendments, everything. At first, the process felt overwhelming. Then I remembered something Richard used to say when we were building our business. "You don't solve a mountain. You solve one rock at a time." So that's what I did. One rock at a time. Every morning I worked through another piece of the puzzle. I contacted banks, requested records, reviewed statements, verified signatures, compared dates, tracked communications. Sometimes I worked for hours. Sometimes I worked until my eyes hurt. And every document told a story. Not one dramatic story, 100 small stories, small actions, small requests, small attempts to gain access. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Exactly as Laura had predicted. One afternoon, I completed a formal cognitive evaluation. At first, I hated the idea. Not because I feared the results, because I resented needing it. I had spent decades running businesses, managing finances, and caring for my family. Now I had to prove I was mentally capable of doing what I had always done. It felt insulting. Laura understood. "You're not doing this because you're weak. You're doing it because we're eliminating arguments." That perspective helped. The evaluation lasted several hours. Memory tests, reasoning tests, problem-solving exercises, financial decision scenarios. The specialist was thorough. When it ended, she smiled warmly. "Hazel, you're doing remarkably well." A week later, the official report arrived. The conclusions were exactly what Richard's earlier evaluation had shown. Fully competent, strong cognitive functioning, no impairment, no diminished judgment, no concerns. I placed the report in Laura's growing evidence file. One more door closed. One more argument Ethan could no longer use. Yet something still bothered me. We had evidence. We had documentation. We had legal protections. But we still needed something stronger. Something that revealed what Ethan was actively doing. Not what he had done months ago, what he was doing now. Ironically, the breakthrough came from the last person I expected. My granddaughter, Lily. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. I was visiting Sarah's house while Ethan attended a business conference. At least that's what he claimed. Sarah was running errands, leaving Lily and me alone. We spent most of the afternoon baking cookies, something we had done since she was little. For a few hours, life felt normal again. Then Lily casually said something that made me pause. "Grandpa was right about Dad." My heart skipped. I carefully set down the mixing spoon. "What do you mean?" Lily immediately looked nervous, the kind of nervous teenagers become when they accidentally reveal something important. "Nothing." I turned toward her. "Lily." She stared at the floor, then sighed. "I wasn't supposed to say anything." That sentence instantly got my attention. Children often notice things adults miss, especially smart children, and Lily was very smart. I sat beside her. "You can tell me." She hesitated. Then she quietly spoke. "A few months ago, I used Dad's laptop for school." I remained silent, letting her continue. "He got upset because I opened the wrong folder." A cold sensation crept through me. "What folder?" "I don't know." "But I remember the name." I leaned forward. "What was it?" Lily swallowed, then answered, "Guardianship." The word hit me like a lightning strike. Guardianship. The same word Laura had discovered. The same legal process Ethan had secretly researched. I tried to remain calm. "What happened?" Lily looked embarrassed. "He grabbed the laptop. Really fast. He seemed scared." Scared. That was interesting. People don't panic over harmless information. They panic when they're hiding something. "What else?" Lily thought for a moment. Then she said something even more surprising. "I saw a lot of emails." "Emails?" My pulse quickened. "What kind of emails?" "I don't know." "Most were open. But then he started deleting things." I stared at her. "Deleting?" She nodded. "He kept emptying his trash folder." Every instinct I possessed suddenly came alive. People don't delete innocent records in bulk. Not repeatedly. Not obsessively. Not unless they're worried someone might eventually see them. I thanked Lily for telling me, then immediately contacted Laura. Within an hour, we were sitting in her office. As I described the conversation, Laura became increasingly interested. When I finished, she leaned back thoughtfully. "This could be important." "Because of the emails." She nodded. "Very important." I frowned. "But we don't have access to them." "Not yet." The way she said it made me curious. Laura smiled slightly. "There are legal ways to obtain records." For the first time that day, hope stirred inside me. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted the truth. And buried somewhere inside those deleted communications, I suspected the truth was waiting. The following week brought another surprise. A letter arrived from a financial institution, one of the institutions Laura had contacted during her investigation. Inside was confirmation that someone had attempted to update communication preferences regarding one of our accounts. The request had ultimately been rejected, but the name attached to the inquiry was unmistakable: Ethan Mitchell. I immediately forwarded the document to Laura. Her response came less than 10 minutes later. 3 words. "Excellent evidence, Hazel." Evidence. That word felt empowering now, because for months Ethan had relied on assumptions, perceptions, narratives, stories. Now we had facts, documents, records, proof, and proof is much harder to manipulate. Still, Laura warned me not to become overconfident. "He doesn't know we're building this case." "Good. Exactly." She smiled. The longer he feels comfortable, the more mistakes he'll make. I understood, and as difficult as it was, I continued pretending everything was normal, pretending I trusted him, pretending I remained unaware. At family gatherings, I smiled politely. At dinners, I listened quietly. When Ethan offered advice, I thanked him. The entire time, Laura and I were collecting evidence piece by piece, brick by brick, until eventually we would have enough. Enough to expose everything. Enough to stop him. Enough to show everyone, including Sarah, that the woman Ethan called too emotional to decide had spent months calmly dismantling his plan. What none of us realized was that the final confrontation was much closer than we thought, because Ethan was preparing his biggest move yet, and soon he would unknowingly walk into the very trap he believed he was setting for me. The call came on a Monday morning. I had just finished watering the flowers on our front porch when my phone rang. It was Sarah. The moment I answered, I could hear tension in her voice. "Mom, Ethan wants everyone to meet this Friday." I froze. "What kind of meeting?" "A legal meeting." My pulse immediately quickened. There it was. The move Laura had been expecting. The move Ethan had been preparing for. The move he believed would finally give him control. I kept my voice calm. "Why?" "He says we need to finalize some family planning decisions." Family planning decisions? The phrase sounded harmless, but I knew better. So did Laura. The moment I ended the call, I contacted her. She listened carefully. Then she said exactly what I expected. "It's happening." Neither of us needed to explain what it meant. The confrontation, the culmination of months of preparation, months of manipulation, months of deception, months of evidence gathering. Laura asked for every detail: location, time, attendees, purpose. By the end of the conversation, she was already outlining a strategy. "We'll let him talk. That's all. For now." I smiled despite my nerves. Laura had spent her entire career dealing with people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. And according to her, those people almost always made the same mistake. They talked too much. Friday arrived faster than I expected. The meeting was scheduled at a private conference room inside a prestigious law office in Columbus. Not Laura's office. An office Ethan had selected. That detail mattered. He wanted home field advantage. He wanted control. He wanted to be the person guiding the conversation. By 10 o'clock that morning, Richard and I were seated at the large conference table. Sarah sat beside Ethan. Lily wasn't there. Thankfully. A teenager shouldn't have to witness what was about to happen. 2 financial professionals were present, along with an attorney Ethan had retained, a man named Douglas Pierce. The atmosphere felt formal, cold, strategic. Everything about the room suggested preparation. Everything except one thing. Ethan had no idea Laura Bennett was coming. That was intentional. As the meeting began, Ethan appeared confident, almost relaxed. The confidence of a man who believed victory was already secured. Douglas Pierce opened the discussion. "We appreciate everyone being here today." Standard legal language, polite, professional, empty. He spent several minutes discussing estate planning, asset protection, future contingencies, long-term family stability. The words sounded reasonable, because they were designed to. Then the conversation gradually shifted, exactly as Laura predicted, toward me, toward my decision-making abilities, toward my emotional state, toward my capacity. Douglas spoke carefully. "We all recognize that recent events have placed tremendous emotional strain on Hazel." There it was again. The foundation of Ethan's entire strategy, emotion, stress, concern, protection. The same story repeated over and over, only now it was being presented in a legal environment, which made it infinitely more dangerous. Ethan leaned forward, his expression filled with manufactured compassion. "Nobody is questioning your intentions, Hazel." I almost laughed, because that is precisely what they were doing. They simply preferred nicer words. "We're only concerned about your well-being." Concern. Always concern. The safest disguise for control. I remained silent. Laura had instructed me not to interrupt, not to argue, not to defend myself. Let him talk. So I did. Ethan continued. "With Richard's health issues and the pressure you've been under, we believe it may be appropriate to simplify certain responsibilities." Simplify, another harmless word hiding a dangerous goal. Reduce authority, transfer authority, concentrate authority. The wording changed. The objective remained the same. Douglas slid several documents onto the table. I recognized them immediately. Trust modifications, authority transfers, management provisions. The same ideas Ethan had introduced during the dinner meeting. Only now they carried legal formatting, legal language, legal pressure. Sarah sat quietly throughout most of the discussion. She looked uncomfortable, nervous, conflicted. The sight hurt me, because I could tell she still didn't fully understand what was happening. She believed she was participating in a protective process, not a takeover. Then Ethan made a mistake. A very big mistake. One born from arrogance. He looked directly at me and said, "Hazel, sometimes loving your family means accepting help." The statement sounded reasonable until he continued, "Especially when you're no longer in the best position to make objective decisions." The room went still. Even Douglas Pierce seemed slightly uncomfortable, because Ethan had finally said it directly. No more subtle suggestions. No more careful implications. He was openly questioning my competence, and he thought nobody could stop him. He was wrong. The conference room door opened. Every head turned. Laura Bennett entered. Calm. Composed. Carrying 2 thick binders. I've never seen someone's confidence disappear faster than Ethan's did in that moment. For a split second, genuine panic flashed across his face. Then he recovered. But it was too late. I had seen it. Laura walked across the room, placed her binders on the table, and sat beside me. "Good morning, everyone." The silence was beautiful. Douglas Pierce frowned. "I wasn't informed additional counsel would be present." Laura smiled politely. "And I wasn't informed this meeting would involve competency-related discussions." Checkmate. The atmosphere changed instantly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For months he had controlled the narrative. Now he no longer controlled the room. Laura opened the first binder. "Since we're discussing Hazel's ability to make decisions, perhaps we should begin with the facts." She handed copies around the table. Cognitive evaluation reports, medical assessments, professional findings, independent specialists, every conclusion identical, fully competent, fully capable, no impairment, no diminished judgment. I watched Ethan's expression carefully. His jaw tightened. The first crack had appeared. Laura continued. "Multiple evaluations conducted by independent professionals." She paused. "None support the claims being implied here today." Douglas Pierce studied the reports. His confidence visibly weakened. That alone was satisfying. But Laura was only getting started. She opened the second binder, and that's when everything truly changed. Inside were records, authorization attempts, communication logs, financial inquiries, bank correspondence, document histories. Evidence. Lots of evidence. Laura distributed copies, then calmly addressed the room. Perhaps we should discuss why Mr. Mitchell has repeatedly attempted to access financial information he was not authorized to obtain. The silence became suffocating. Sarah turned toward Ethan, confused, completely confused. "What is she talking about?" Ethan immediately responded. "I was helping." Helping. The familiar excuse. But this time it sounded weaker. Much weaker. Laura calmly produced another document, then another, then another. Each one telling the same story. Requests, attempts, inquiries, patterns. Not isolated incidents, a coordinated effort. Douglas Pierce's face grew increasingly serious. He was beginning to realize his client had not shared everything, a dangerous realization for any attorney. Then Laura delivered the blow that shattered whatever remained of Ethan's confidence. She placed a final document on the table, a report summarizing evidence of potential financial exploitation and unauthorized document activity. The room became silent. Not ordinary silence. Shock. Pure shock. Laura's voice remained calm. "Based on the evidence currently available, we have serious concerns regarding attempted financial manipulation and possible signature irregularities." Sarah looked like she had stopped breathing. Ethan's face turned pale. Douglas slowly lowered the document he was reading. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw something I never thought I would see. Fear. Not my fear. Ethan's. Because he had entered that room expecting me to defend myself. Instead, he was the one being questioned. And the evidence Laura hadn't yet revealed, the strongest evidence of all, was still waiting. The silence inside that conference room felt heavier than any argument. For months, Ethan had controlled every conversation. Every discussion seemed to end with people worrying about me, questioning me, protecting me. Now, for the first time, the spotlight had shifted, and Ethan didn't like it. Not at all. His face had lost its usual confidence. The easy smile was gone. The calm, polished financial advisor persona was beginning to crack. Sarah noticed it too. I could see confusion spreading across her face. Not anger. Not yet. Confusion. The kind that comes when reality suddenly stops matching the story you've been told. Laura Bennett remained perfectly composed. She had spent years preparing legal strategies. She understood something most people don't. The strongest evidence isn't always the loudest evidence. It's the evidence that leaves no room for explanation. And she still had plenty of it. Ethan cleared his throat. "I think we're taking ordinary family involvement and turning it into something sinister." His voice sounded steady, but only barely. Laura nodded politely. "That's certainly one interpretation." Then she opened another section of her binder. I knew what was coming. Ethan didn't. Sarah certainly didn't. And what happened next changed everything. Laura removed a printed series of email records, carefully organized, date-stamped, verified. She handed copies around the table. Sarah began reading. Douglas Pierce began reading. Even the financial advisor sitting near the end of the table began reading. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Finally, Sarah looked up. "What is this?" Laura answered. "Electronic correspondence. Between Ethan and various institutions." Sarah turned toward her husband. Ethan immediately shifted in his chair. "Those are being taken out of context." Laura smiled. A very small smile. The smile of someone who knew the facts were stronger than excuses. "Then let's discuss the context." One email described efforts to streamline authority over certain family assets. Another referenced removing decision-making obstacles. Another discussed future management structures. Individually, none of them sounded devastating. Together, they painted a very different picture. A picture of someone planning for control, not assistance, not support. Control. Sarah continued reading. The color slowly drained from her face. I watched my daughter carefully. The change wasn't immediate. It happened piece by piece, line by line, email by email. Every document forced her to confront something she had avoided for months. The possibility that Ethan had not been acting out of concern. The possibility that her husband had been manipulating everyone, including her. Then Laura delivered the most important piece of evidence. The evidence Richard had protected for over a year, the recording. The room froze as Laura placed the digital recorder on the conference table. Ethan's eyes widened immediately. A reaction so quick he couldn't hide it. My heart pounded, even though I had heard the recording before, even though I knew what it contained. Because now Sarah would hear it. Now everyone would hear it. Laura pressed play. Static filled the room. Then Richard's voice. Then Ethan's. The recording unfolded exactly as it had before. Business discussions, trust discussions, future planning. Then the crucial moment. The moment that changed everything. "Eventually, someone will have to take control of all this." Ethan's recorded voice echoed through the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The sentence hung in the air like a storm cloud. Then came more. More comments. More assumptions. More references to future authority, future control, future influence. When the recording ended, the room remained silent. Sarah stared at her husband, not blinking, not speaking, just staring. For the first time, I saw genuine doubt in her eyes. Not doubt about me. Doubt about Ethan. He immediately tried to recover. "You're misunderstanding what I meant." No one answered. Even Douglas Pierce seemed reluctant to speak, because some things are difficult to explain away, and intent is one of them. Then Sarah finally found her voice. "Ethan?" Her voice trembled. "What was that?" He looked at her. "It wasn't what it sounds like." "What does it sound like?" The question hit harder than any accusation, because it came from the person who trusted him most. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in years, he didn't have a perfect answer. Sarah lowered her eyes toward the documents. Then she noticed something else. An email. One specific email. I recognized it immediately. Laura had highlighted it earlier. At the bottom sat a verified electronic signature. Ethan Mitchell. The email discussed planning conversations regarding guardianship concerns. Guardianship. The word Sarah had never heard before, at least not in this context. She looked up slowly. "What is guardianship?" No one answered immediately. Finally, Laura spoke. "It is a legal process through which decision-making authority can be transferred when someone is believed incapable of managing their own affairs." Sarah's face went completely white. She turned toward Ethan. "You were looking into guardianship." His silence was devastating, because silence sometimes tells the truth faster than words. Sarah stood abruptly. The movement startled everyone. She looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. "You told me you were helping my mother." "I was." "You told me you were protecting our family." "I was." "You told me all of this was because you were worried about her." His answers sounded weaker now, desperate, like someone trying to hold together a collapsing structure. Then Sarah asked the question that shattered everything. "Did you ever intend to tell me about the guardianship discussions?" Ethan didn't answer. That was enough. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "I had imagined this moment many times. I thought I would feel vindicated, victorious, satisfied. Instead, I felt heartbreak, because watching your child discover betrayal is painful no matter who betrays them, even when the truth needs to come out. Especially then." Sarah slowly sat back down. For several minutes, she said nothing. She simply stared at the table, at the documents, at the evidence, at the life she suddenly wasn't sure she understood anymore. Then she whispered something, so quietly, I almost missed it. "You lied to me." Ethan immediately shook his head. "No." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. For the first time, she was looking backward, reviewing years of conversations, years of explanations, years of warnings she had dismissed. I could practically see the memories forming connections, the strange comments, the repeated concerns, the constant references to my emotions, the endless discussions about control. All of it suddenly made sense. And once a person sees the pattern, they can't unsee it. Douglas Pierce finally cleared his throat. His expression had changed dramatically. He no longer looked like an attorney representing a strong position. He looked like an attorney realizing his client had withheld critical information. A dangerous situation for any lawyer. Laura calmly closed her binder. She didn't need to say much more. The evidence was already speaking for itself. Then Ethan made one final mistake, a mistake born from panic. He pointed directly at me. "This is exactly what she wanted." The room turned toward him. "She turned everyone against me." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, because after months of portraying me as confused and emotional, he was now the one lashing out emotionally. The irony was impossible to miss. Laura remained calm. Richard remained calm. Even I remained calm. Only Ethan seemed unable to control himself, and everyone noticed, especially Sarah, the woman who had defended him for months, the woman who had trusted him most, the woman now realizing that her husband had spent months manipulating her perception of her own mother. By the time the meeting ended, no formal decisions had been made, no documents had been signed, no authority had been transferred, but something much more important had happened. The illusion had been destroyed. The narrative Ethan spent months building had collapsed in a single afternoon. And as Sarah quietly walked away from him, refusing to take his hand, I realized the truth had finally reached the one person who needed to hear it most. My daughter. The only question remaining now was whether the damage he caused could ever truly be repaired, and whether our family could somehow find a way to heal after everything he had done. The weeks following that meeting felt strangely quiet. After months of tension, accusations, and uncertainty, the silence almost felt unreal. For so long, every day had brought a new worry, a new document, a new revelation, a new reason to fear what Ethan might do next. Then suddenly, everything stopped. Not because the damage disappeared, because the truth had finally come into the light. And once truth is exposed, it becomes much harder to manipulate. The first major change came from Sarah. 3 days after the meeting, she showed up at my front door alone. No Ethan, no explanations, no advance phone call. Just Sarah, standing there with tears in her eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I simply looked at my daughter, the same little girl I had once carried into kindergarten, the same young woman whose wedding day had been one of the happiest days of my life, the same daughter who had sat silently while her husband questioned my competence. I would be lying if I said that memory didn't hurt. It did. Deeply. Sarah looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a weight that had finally become too heavy. "Mom!" Her voice broke, and suddenly she was crying. Not polite tears, not controlled tears, the kind of tears that come when guilt, grief, and regret collide all at once. I opened the door wider. She stepped inside. A few minutes later, we were sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spent countless mornings helping her with homework, the same table where Richard and I had celebrated birthdays and holidays. Now it held a different kind of conversation, one neither of us wanted, but both of us needed. Sarah stared down at her hands. "I'm sorry." I remained silent, not because I wanted to punish her, because I needed her to continue. And she did. "I should have listened." More tears followed. "I should have trusted you." That sentence nearly broke my heart, because trust was the real casualty in all of this. Not money, not legal documents. Trust, the thing families depend on most. Sarah wiped her eyes. I kept thinking Ethan was trying to help. I nodded slowly. "I know. I thought he was protecting us." "I know." She looked up. The pain in her eyes was almost unbearable. But he was manipulating me too. There it was, the truth she had finally accepted. The truth I had slowly begun to understand months earlier. Manipulation rarely affects only one person. People like Ethan create entire systems of influence. They shape conversations, perceptions, relationships, and they often convince good people to help them without realizing it. Sarah had become part of Ethan's plan, not because she was cruel, because she trusted the wrong person. I reached across the table and took her hand. The moment I did, she began crying again. "I don't know how to fix this." Neither did I. Some wounds don't have simple solutions. Some betrayals leave scars. But scars aren't the same as permanent damage, and that distinction matters. Over the following months, our family slowly began rebuilding. Not everything. Some things can never return to exactly what they were, but enough. Enough to move forward. Richard's health improved steadily, the physical therapy continued, the medications helped. His strength gradually returned. One afternoon, nearly 4 months after the meeting, he walked across our backyard without assistance. A simple moment, yet I found myself crying as I watched. Not because he walked, because there had been a time when I feared he never would again. Life has a way of teaching gratitude through fear. You don't fully appreciate ordinary moments until you nearly lose them. As for Ethan, his situation became increasingly complicated. Laura's evidence had triggered multiple reviews, financial reviews, document reviews, compliance reviews. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. Real investigations rarely do, but the consequences were real. Several institutions began examining his activities. Questions were asked. Records were requested. Explanations became necessary. And for the first time, Ethan found himself in the position he had tried to place me in, having to justify his actions. having to defend his decisions, having to answer uncomfortable questions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Laura. One afternoon, she called with an update. "Your trust is secure." Those 4 words brought more relief than I expected. Not because of the money, because the trust represented something larger. 45 years of work, sacrifice, dreams, late nights, risk. Everything Richard and I had built together. It deserved protection, and now it had it. The business remained protected as well. The properties, the accounts, the estate planning structure, everything Ethan had hoped to influence remained exactly where it belonged, under the authority of the people who created it. Months later, Sarah made another difficult decision. She separated from Ethan. I won't discuss all the details. Some parts of that story belong to her, not me. But I will say this. Leaving someone you've trusted for years is incredibly painful, even when it's the right decision, perhaps especially then. Lily handled everything better than I expected. She was hurt, disappointed, confused. But she was also remarkably mature. One evening, she sat beside me on the porch. "Grandma, yes. Why do people change?" The question caught me off guard. I thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes they don't change." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes we simply discover who they were all along." She sat quietly for a moment, then nodded. I think she understood, at least partly. The rest would come with time. Eventually, the family gathered again for Thanksgiving, the first truly peaceful Thanksgiving in years. Richard sat at the head of the table. Sarah sat beside Lily. Laughter filled the house. Not forced laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes when people finally feel safe. At one point, I looked around the room and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. Because we had survived. Families don't need perfection. They need honesty. Without honesty, trust dies. Without trust, relationships become performances, and I had spent enough time around performances to last a lifetime. Later that evening, after everyone left, Richard and I sat together in the living room. The house was quiet, peaceful, for the first time in a very long time. He reached for my hand. "You were stronger than you think." I smiled. "So were you." He laughed softly. "No." Then he squeezed my hand. "We were." And he was right. Neither of us could have survived this alone. Not the legal battle, not the emotional betrayal, not the uncertainty. We survived because we stood together, the same way we had for 45 years. As I reflect on everything that happened, one lesson stands above all the others. People often confuse emotion with weakness. They see tears and assume incompetence. They see grief and assume incapacity. They see kindness and assume vulnerability. They're wrong. Emotion does not erase wisdom. Compassion does not erase strength. And age certainly does not erase experience. Ethan believed my emotions made me easy to control. What he never understood was that the same love that made me cry for my family also gave me the strength to fight for them. In the end, he lost because he underestimated the very thing he mocked: a mother's heart and a lifetime of experience behind it. Every family faces moments that test trust, loyalty, and character. What I learned through this experience is that being emotional does not make a person incapable. In fact, some of the strongest decisions we ever make come from a place of love, compassion, and deep responsibility. Too often, older people are dismissed simply because they show emotion. Society sometimes treats tears as weakness and age as decline. But wisdom is not measured by how loudly we speak or how rarely we cry. Wisdom comes from experience, resilience, and the lessons we earn throughout our lives. I also learned that protecting yourself is not the same as being selfish. Setting boundaries, asking questions, reading documents carefully, and standing up for yourself are acts of self-respect. The people who truly love you will never fear your independence. They will celebrate it. Most importantly, I learned that truth has a way of finding the light. It may take time. It may require patience, but honesty eventually reveals what manipulation tries to hide. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age, your emotions, or your kindness? What would you have done in my situation? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, and join us for more stories about family resilience, justice, and hope. Thank you for spending this time with me.